Before empires fell, before walls crumbled, before the world learned to fear the sound of hooves, there was the steppe, a vast ocean of grass stretching beyond the horizon. For the nomadic peoples of Eurasia, this land was not simply home. It was the harshest training ground on Earth. From childhood, life on the steppe shaped them into predators, not through books or drills, but through survival itself. Winters here could kill without mercy. Summers burned the ground dry. Food was never guaranteed. Water was always precious. To survive, a child learned to ride almost as soon as they could walk, learned to shoot before they could read, learned that hesitation meant death. In settled civilizations, armies were created, trained, and maintained. On the steppe, the entire society was the army. There were no farmers to protect, no cities to retreat to. Every adult male was a warrior, and every warrior was always ready. Their greatest weapon was not forged in fire, but born from necessity, the composite bow. Unlike the simple wooden bows used by infantry armies in Europe or China, this bow was layered with wood, horn, and sinew, giving it terrifying power. It could shoot farther, faster, and with deadly accuracy, even from the back of a galloping horse. To the soldiers of walled cities, this felt unnatural, as if the enemy itself were part of the wind. And beneath every rider was another weapon just as important: the steppe horse. Small, tough, endlessly resilient. While European war horses required grain and care, these horses survived on frozen grass, traveling vast distances without rest. A nomadic warrior often rode with several horses, switching mounts to stay fresh, allowing entire armies to move at speeds no settled force could match. But strength alone does not conquer continents. Structure does. And here, the nomads revealed a discipline that shocked their enemies. Their armies were organized in a strict decimal system: groups of 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000. Orders did not rely on shouting. They traveled through flags, horns, and whistling arrows cutting through the air. This allowed commanders to control battles spread across miles of open land, something unimaginable to traditional medieval armies. To the outside world, these riders appeared chaotic, savage, uncontrollable. But beneath that illusion was a system refined by generations of survival, a living war machine shaped by the steppe itself. And yet, before this machine could turn outward, before cities and empires felt its weight, it first had to do something far more brutal. It had to conquer its own people. Before the world was conquered, the steppe itself had to be broken and reforged. Nomadic empires were not born in unity. They were forged through internal conquest, tribe against tribe, clan against clan. Brothers turned rivals beneath the same endless sky. For figures like Temujin, later known as Genghis Khan, or Attila of the Huns, the first enemies were never distant empires. They were familiar faces, former allies, even kin. On the steppe, loyalty was fragile, built on survival rather than bloodlines, and power belonged only to those who could protect and provide. Temujin rose not by noble birth, but by ruthless clarity. He shattered old aristocracies, executed rival chieftains, and absorbed defeated tribes into a single force. This was revolutionary for its time. In many cultures, conquered peoples were enslaved or erased. On the steppe, they were reorganized, redistributed across units so old loyalties dissolved, a deliberate strategy to prevent rebellion. Attila followed a similar path centuries earlier, uniting fractious Hunnic clans through fear and reward. Those who resisted vanished. Those who submitted were elevated. Strength replaced lineage. Obedience replaced tradition. Once unity was achieved, it was sealed by law, the great decree, known as the Yasa. This was not a written constitution in the Western sense, but a living code enforced with absolute severity. It regulated everything: military discipline, theft, betrayal, even how spoils were shared. Punishment was swift, often death, not out of cruelty alone, but to maintain cohesion in a society where hesitation could collapse the whole structure. Under the Yasa, the nomadic world transformed. There were no civilians, only contributors to war. Families moved with the army. Logistics traveled on horseback. Herds became supply lines. Every man was a soldier. Every soldier a cog in an unstoppable machine. To settled civilizations, this was incomprehensible. How could a society exist without cities, without farms, without borders? Yet that very absence made them terrifyingly flexible. And now, unified, disciplined, and hungry. The steppe did what it had always done. It looked outward, toward lands rich with walls, rivers, and untested confidence. Once the tribes were unified, the nomads did not rush blindly into conquest. They listened first, watched first, long before an army appeared on the horizon. The steppe had already entered the enemy's world. Nomadic warfare began with absence, not presence. Scouts rode weeks, sometimes months ahead of the main force, spreading out like mist across the land. They mapped rivers and wells, counted livestock, measured the morale of border towns, and more importantly, listened for resentment, rivalries, and quiet fractures within the enemy's society. To settled kingdoms, this kind of intelligence gathering was unfamiliar. Western and East Asian armies of the era relied on fixed borders, messengers, and slow reports. The nomads relied on memory, oral transmission, and speed. A scout did not carry paper. He carried the land itself in his mind. By the time a city realized it had been noticed, its weaknesses were already known. Which gates were poorly guarded, which generals hated each other, which allies would arrive too late. Then came the most infamous tactic of all, the feigned retreat. To an untrained eye, it looked like panic. Riders breaking formation, dropping supplies, fleeing in apparent terror. This was intentional. It played directly into the instincts of infantry commanders, especially those trained in Roman, Persian, or Chinese traditions. Victory meant pursuit. Pursuit meant honor. So the defenders left their walls, crossed the safety of rivers and roads, and followed the retreating nomads into open ground. That was the moment the steppe closed its fist. The fleeing riders split, curved, vanished behind hills, and reappeared on the flanks. Horns echoed across the plain. Arrows fell like rain. And the enemy found itself surrounded, exhausted, and unable to retreat. It was not chaos. It was choreography, practiced since childhood through hunting, where prey was lured, encircled, and brought down without mercy. Entire armies vanished this way, not through heroic last stands, but through miscalculation, pride, and the fatal belief that the enemy was running. And as the dust settled and the plains fell silent again, the nomads gathered, reformed, and moved on, leaving behind no warning, only emptiness. Ahead of them now stood something different: stone walls, towers, and cities that believed themselves eternal. Cities believed the steppe would break against stone, that walls were the end of the nomad's world. And at first, they were right. Nomadic empires were born in motion, not masonry. Their strength was speed, not siegecraft. But what made them terrifying was not what they knew. It was how quickly they learned. When the riders reached the walls of fortified cities, they did not waste themselves in reckless assaults. They waited, they watched, and then they adapted. Instead of smashing stone with brute force, they captured knowledge. Chinese engineers, Persian mathematicians, Arab chemists, anyone who understood levers, fire, counterweights, and fear. These specialists were not killed. They were absorbed, protected, and ordered to build. Within months, sometimes weeks, the nomads possessed trebuchets, torsion engines, early incendiaries, even primitive gunpowder weapons. To the defenders, this was horrifying. The enemy outside the walls was not supposed to know these things. Then came the blockade. The nomads did not need to breach walls quickly. They had time. They cut supply roads, poisoned or diverted water sources, burned fields beyond the horizon. Cities that once shone with trade and music slowly became islands of hunger. Disease followed, morale collapsed, and desperation did the rest. When the walls finally fell, it was often not from impact, but from silence. Gates opened by starving hands, commanders betrayed by their own men. And once one city fell, its fate was carried by survivors, by refugees, by smoke visible from miles away. The steppe understood something ancient and cruel. Walls protect bodies, but stories break souls. As the riders moved on, the next cities already knew what waited behind their stones, and fear began doing the work of armies. Before the arrows fell, before the hooves thundered, the war had already begun. Nomadic empires understood something that settled kingdoms often ignored. The human mind breaks long before the body does. Their strategy was brutally simple: surrender early, pay tribute, live, resist, and be erased. This was not chaos. It was policy, a calculated choice offered again and again. When a city refused to submit, the response was absolute, not out of rage, but out of intention. One city destroyed, so 10 more would open their gates without a fight. Survivors were sometimes spared, not out of mercy, but so they could carry the story forward, whispering what they had seen. Cities turned to ash, streets silent, towers collapsed into smoke. Fear traveled faster than any horse. By the time the riders appeared on the horizon, many cities were already defeated. Leaders arguing, merchants fleeing, soldiers doubting. Smoke rising from distant ruins became the nomads' messengers, their diplomats, their warning written across the sky. To the settled world, this felt like cruelty beyond reason. But to the steppe, it was efficiency: fewer battles, fewer losses, faster conquest. Terror was not the goal. It was the tool, and as fear spread across valleys and rivers, The world itself seemed to bend, opening roads, unlocking gates, surrendering without resistance. Soon, entire regions fell not to swords, but to the expectation of them. Once fear had cleared the roads, the conquest moved like a tide, not a single wave, but an ocean, flowing in every direction at once. Nomadic armies did not advance along one front. They split, rejoined, vanished, and returned somewhere no one expected. To people living behind walls and borders, it felt unreal, as if geography itself had betrayed them. In China, the Jin dynasty collapsed under relentless pressure. Cities fell one by one, supply lines shattered, emperors fleeing south while the steppe followed like a shadow. In Central Asia, the Khwarezmian Empire, rich, proud, and confident behind its walls, was erased in a matter of years, not because it was weak, but because it underestimated speed, coordination, and revenge. The destruction was so total that later historians struggled to believe it. Rivers clogged with debris, libraries burned, entire regions emptied. To the west, the nomads reached lands that had never imagined invasion from the east. The Russ's principalities, Hungary, the edges of Europe itself. Messages arrived too late. Armies marched in the wrong direction. Alliances formed after cities were already gone. Chroniclers wrote of riders who appeared without warning, struck, and disappeared before retaliation could arrive. Many believed this was not an army, but divine punishment. The scourge of God sent to humble the world. What terrified observers most was the speed. A force could travel hundreds of miles in weeks, fighting, scouting, encircling, without losing cohesion. Horses were rotated. Riders slept in the saddle. Commands passed by signal and instinct, against armies tied to roads, crops, and seasons. The nomads seemed unstoppable. And yet, beneath the thunder, there was order, logistics, discipline. This was not chaos sweeping the world. It was conquest perfected, an ocean that drowned empires, not all at once, but everywhere. And when the tide finally slowed, it left behind a transformed world, one bound together by fear, roads, and rule. When the thunder of hooves finally began to fade, something unexpected settled over the conquered lands. Not freedom, but order. The nomads did not stay forever as raiders. Once resistance ended, they became administrators. Cities that surrendered were spared, their markets reopened, their artisans protected, their religions left untouched. The conquerors did not ask people to change who they were, only that they obey, pay tribute, and keep the roads open. For many survivors, this rule felt strange, brutal in memory, yet calm in practice. Taxes were fixed, laws were clear, punishments were absolute but predictable. Under the Great Law, known to history as the Yasa, status no longer came from birth alone, but from loyalty and usefulness. A shepherd could rise, a noble could fall. Merchants were granted protection, scholars were valued, engineers were spared when cities fell, because knowledge was more valuable than stone. Across Asia, the Silk Road breathed again. For the first time in centuries, caravans could travel from China to the Mediterranean under a single authority. Bandits vanished, Borders dissolved. Merchants slept without guards. Ideas traveled with goods, paper, maps, medicine, astronomy, even stories. This was the Iron Peace, forged through unimaginable violence, then maintained through fear and efficiency. To later generations, it seemed like a paradox. How could so much death create stability? But history often moves this way. Destruction clearing paths that gentler forces never could. The nomadic empires did not build many monuments. Their legacy was movement, connection, and a world suddenly aware of itself as one vast landmass. And yet, no peace lasts forever. Beneath the calm roads, change was already coming. A new sound, distant at first, like thunder, but not from hooves. The sound came slowly, at first mistaken for distant storms. A dull crack carried on the wind. Not hooves, but fire. Gunpowder changed the balance of the world. Walls that once feared arrows now resisted them. Infantry learned to stand firm. Cannons learned to speak louder than cavalry. The steppe horse, tireless and loyal, could not outrun metal and flame forever. As borders hardened, cities grew heavier, roads turned inward. The open world that nomads once ruled began to close. Empires of motion faced empires of stone and smoke. The descendants of the great riders adapted. Some settled, some ruled as kings, others vanished into the grasslands. The thunder that once terrified continents softened into memory. Historians would later argue over numbers, dates, causes. But the truth is quieter. No force dominates forever. The same winds that carried arrows across the steppe now carry only dust. And somewhere, beneath the long sky, the grass still bends as it always has, indifferent to empires. The horses return to grazing. The camps grow smaller. The fires dim. What remains is not conquest, but echo. A reminder that speed, discipline, and understanding the land can change the fate of the world, and that even the greatest storms must eventually pass. Now, let your breath slow. Imagine the hooves becoming heartbeats, the vast steppe covered in silver moonlight. The riders fade into mist. History exhales, and sleep arrives.